Welcome to this week's installment of Exploring the World Through Different Lens, where we at NPR Chicago reframe global narrative as we investigate the history of those history forgot. In light of the recent death of the great revolutionary Fidel Castro, we'll spend our hour today investigating the history of Cuba. We hope today to discuss the history of what we term the new Cuban woman. As she rose under Castro's policies in the 1960s and 70s, she has greater autonomy than ever before, but is confined within a culture so openly paternalistic, her story remains largely forgotten in both United States and Cuban public consciousness. Here on the show with me today, I have quite an assortment of scholars. Carly Priest, a visiting professor of history from the University of Miami, Florida. Sir Pierce, professor of law and economics at Cambridge University. The Reverend Dr. Liam Driscoll, contemporary expert in Third World liberationist theologies, and Dr. Molly Caulfield, who currently conducts research in Havana about the idea of religion and poverty. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having us today, Keith.
From my understanding, you have each, in your independent areas of research, developed a similar theory. As depicted in this distinctively Cuban artistic medium, posters, produced in the 1960s and 70s, though the Cuban Revolution attempted to create space for meaningful female autonomy in the political, socioeconomic, and cultural realms, such space was narrow, ill-defined, and riddled with economic roadblocks. I'm curious as to the political aspects of this. Does anyone have anything to add about this poster medium, what it means, what characterized this unique medium?
I think I can answer that, Keith. Thank you for having us. Cuba was very active in funding propaganda and proliferating propaganda throughout the developing world. And Cuban propaganda in and of itself was very unique for a couple key reasons. It always had those Marxist undertones that you would see in other countries. However, Cuban propaganda was often very bright. It used very bright pigments and pastels and bright colors, and it was often very abstract, typical of the 1960s and 70s, but you see that more so coming out of Cuba than you do out of virtually any other communist and certainly any other capitalist country. So most of the posters were of that. They were abstract, and they didn't fully show the human body, but it would be within this Marxist line of thought that we're so familiar with, with a distinctly Cuban touch to it.
Fascinating. I look forward to your explorations of this new Cuban woman through these artistic mediums, these uniquely Cuban artistic mediums. Anyway, back to our program. Carly, I was wondering if you could comment on both the general characteristics for this distinctly Cuban poster media we respect to discuss on this morning's show, a little bit about the general policies concerning women from newly independent Cuba.
Yeah, absolutely. Keith, thank you so much for having us here today. As part of his campaign to create the new Cuba, Fidel Castro gives particular importance to the idea of the new Cuban man, the revolutionary who's willing to seize his own liberty from the hands of his oppressor, by violence or guerrilla war tactic if necessary. In my opinion, it's this anomaly of a new Cuban man without a female compatriot that so draws scholars to this question of whether or not the new Cuban woman was an idea that was even informally articulated by the Cuban government. So up until the late 1950s, 1959 revolution, the role of women as political, social, independent entities in Cuba was fairly static. As the economic subordination of women made them one of the largely poorest demographics, the revolution pushes several structural reforms to provide women with economic agency, especially through working opportunities outside of the home. Castro specifically passes the Family Code in 1975 to grant men and women equal rights and responsibilities across public and private spheres, which theoretically mandates that men and women should be held as equally responsible in the domestic realm. However, as Lynn Bryden and Sylvia Chan illustrate in the introduction to their work, Women in the Third World, Gender Issues in Rural and Urban Areas, the section of the code that concerns relationship between husband and wife states that marriage is established with equal rights and duties for both partners to the extent of their capacity for such possibilities, indicating that even in this codified form, the idea of male and female equality was open to such interpretation. This becomes especially even more important, with a recognition for the machismo ideology that's contained within the framework of patriarchal normativity in many Latin American communities. Specifically in Cuba, machismo, as Bryden and Chant articulate, was the male control of women. It has manifestations of machismo culture include male domination of household and other familial decision-making, along with the imposition of restrictions on women's social, sexual, and economic freedoms. So while Castro widely expands the economic abilities of women to become their own self-advocates by expanding the workforce, completely eliminating the domestic sphere, and really expanding on countrywide literacy campaigns that specifically target women, we see that patriarchal framework of machismo culture really inhibits their ability to independently grow as economic entities. And we see this very much so in depictions of women in this new Cuban medium, the Cuban poster, specifically for their absence much of the time. We see these posters largely depicting famous guerrilla warfare figures, famous revolutionary figures, or even the anomalous new man of Cuba, but there's really no regard given to females in this capacity. One such aspect of Cuban poster making that does focus on women is Castro's own encouragement for the Federation of Cuban Women, which is an organization where he encourages women to come together under a communist framework to better articulate the different kinds of oppression that face them in the new Cuban society. Interestingly, the Federation for Cuban Women doesn't articulate a distinctly feminist train of thought, but more humanist. What we, as contemporary scholars, consider a humanist movement, wherein women and men don't deserve equal rights, but all people deserve equal rights. So we see this replicated in these Cuban posters. Specifically, there's a poster published by the Federation for Cuban Women in 1965 that's created for the Organization of Latin American Solidarity. And it's a woman who is very much in the focus. It's a very humanistic rendering of the female form and female body. She's tilted sideways. We only see her in parallel and pointing off frame with mountains behind her. This both alludes to Castro's own understanding of women as largely the rural, more poverty-stricken spheres. But as she's depicted in kind of a framework for guerrilla warfare, we don't see her engaged in any sort of action. Unlike many guerrilla warfare portraits, her face is not face forward, but it's to the side, distinctly non-confrontational. The poster itself is also in much more of a subdued hue than we see typical for Cuban print art. Later on, we see something that replicates more traditional forms of Cuban poster making, specifically Herberto Echeverria's March of the International Women's Day posters. It's a very abstract image of a woman's face, but it's distinctly feminine. It's very brightly colored. There's yellow in the background, blue in the front, with different colored flowers surrounding. She doesn't look, again, directly on the camera, but kind of looks forlornly off into the sideways view. It's these distinctly feminized portraits of what it means to be a revolutionary leader that really brings into question the role of woman in this new politic. And I think that shows especially in the ways that these different literary and literacy campaigns target women without fully separating women from a larger crowd of uneducated.
Thank you, Professor Priest. That was a very well elaborated and in-depth analysis. I think you certainly established some ambiguity in this, and otherwise a simplistic portrayal of women's path to equality and empowerment.
Thank you, Keith.
Yes. So, Sir Pierce, I was wondering if you wanted to weigh in on this.
Sure, Keith. On the economic side of things, one of the goals of the revolutionary government was to directly confront sexist beliefs and ideologies and make its approach to gender inequality different from its approach to race. That is, they wanted to incorporate the ideal standard was to incorporate women into the Cuban economy as much as men were. However, it's also worth noting that this encouragement of women into the for instance, in the Federation of Cuban Women, was to defend a revolution whose interests were defined by a male elite. And economically, women did make significant strides during the communist era, jumping from 13% of the Cuban workforce in 1950 to 40% in the 1990s. Similarly, Cuba's health revolution benefited the lives of women as well. With contraception and abortions widely available, Cuba boasted an infant mortality rate on par with the United States by the 1990s. However, all this aside, issues with Cuba's food supply forced women to give up work in order to stand in line for food during the 1960s. They literally had to stand in line all day, and they couldn't work because of this. This economic fluctuation continued on with the legalization of the American dollar in Cuba, as opposed to the Cuban peso. With this special era, certain sexist undertones reemerged under the guise of socialist reform. To quote cinematographer Belkis Vega, "This special period has weakened the struggle of women's revitalization. If feminism gets weakened because women are exhausted from the struggle of trying to survive, other struggles become secondary, because this struggle is one for food, of how do I feed my family, of how do I keep my house, of how do I manage to provide my children with food and clothing." And that takes a front stage role. The work takes up so much time that all you want to do at the end of the day is watch a soap opera to disconnect. So as a result of this special era, many young Cuban women of color were forced into or drawn into prostitution. As a result, deeply held undertones of sexism re-arose as genteras, which is a pejorative word for a prostitute, on the undesirable role of accepting payment from foreign sex tourists. At the same time, however, Cuba was dumping prolific humanitarian aid to other developing countries. And with this enormous amount of aid flowing from Cuba to other countries, a steady flow of propaganda followed, upholding these idealistic visions of women as equals to men in the revolution, even though these might not have been fully upholded on the island itself. We should look to Berta Abelanda's poster for a day of solidarity with the people of South Africa. Though propaganda such as that poster portrays the communist woman as strong and robust and capable and fierce in these bright, magnificent colors, ironically, these very ideas of equality that Cuba espoused abroad were more difficult to implement on the island itself. Literacy and work programs that progressed too rapidly and sent the Cuban economy into turmoil, and women were forced to take more traditional, subservient roles just to get by. And as such, the figures portrayed in Cuban guerrilla propaganda, such as Faustino Perez's Days of Solidarity with Venezuela and Palestine, tended to omit women from this more machismo and masculine propaganda, since failed literacy programs and the problematic reintroduction of the dollar pushed women back towards typical subservient economic roles.
Thank you, Carly and Oliver. I feel like both of you are really complicating the idea of women's empowerment during this period by situating it within a broader power structure still made by men and for men, as well as greater economic considerations that demanded attention. Yes, it seems like you both are getting at a somewhat unshakable patriarchal culture that survived and reformulated despite the radical legal changes enacted during the revolution. These legal changes explicitly facilitated and increased women's economic participation, availability of reproductive care and bodily autonomy, and increased and aided them in politically organizing, but it appears did not necessarily offer an immediate shift in the cultural imagination, still imbued with and underpinned by the ever-salient machismo ideology. Moreover, some of these reforms became difficult to actualize as material conditions, such as the care economy, demanded attention as the government could not provide enough daycare to meet needs. In the 1980s and 1990s, Cuba had over 1 million women workers and only 100,000 daycare slots. And food scarcities required women leave the workshop and queue for food in the 60s and 70s. Despite the explicit encoding of women's equality into a number of revolutionary reforms, you both find that these legal reforms do not necessarily destabilize the patriarchal culture that women are still forced to operate within. I think that it's time for a break. When we return, we will continue to explore the complex social positioning of the Cuban woman and extrapolate some more meaning from these visual representations. All right. All right, and we are back. And I'd like to continue exploring this influential patriarchal ideology. I mean, I have to wonder, how might the construction of masculinity during this period be operating to inhibit women's progress during this time? We know that the socio-historically specific discourse of same-sex sexual practices between men involved an explicit devaluing of the feminine, both in its early formation, the macho-mare-cone dichotomy, which allowed masculine performing men to engage in same-sex sexual practices as penetrative partners, but demeaned and stigmatized men who were penetrated and embodied more culturally feminine attributes. This, in addition to Castro's regime's later embrace of the homosexual as a deviant and psychologically ill subject unfit to represent revolutionary ideals. Castro is quoted as asserting homosexuals could never be considered a true revolutionary. And this heightened and elaboration of these certain human types further police the boundaries of proper masculinity and femininity, endowing them with even greater cultural capital. One cannot help but see in this bolstering and privileging of a narrow conception of masculinity a simultaneous devaluing of the feminine, a misogynistic undertone that continuously remains active in the construction of revolutionary ideals. Dr. Reverend Leon, I would love for you to weigh in. How do you think masculinity is being constructed during this period, and how is it affecting women's status in Cuban society? Could this also be related to the economy, as Sir Pierce has touched upon?
Hey Keith, thanks for having me. So, as Oliver discussed briefly, Cuba has a history of providing foreign aid to oppressed countries including Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and Angola. As a government, Cuba prioritizes their humanitarian efforts on a global scale. Cuban leaders envision themselves as the big brother to those countries in need. The vision of Cuba as a big brother begins with the revolutionary government's belief in guerrilla warfare and the Hombre Nuevo. René Maderas' poster, 10th Anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, 1959 to 1969, depicts the image of the new man by showing Fidel Castro celebrating triumphantly amongst his fellow soldiers. He leads from the front and stands next to his men, rather than a general who sends the low-ranking men in first. They all stand triumphantly, sweltering with pride. The Hombre Nuevo, as defined by Castro and Che Guevara, stands for selflessness, guerrilla warfare, equality, hard work, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism. It is the new man, the guerrilla fighter's duty to champion the rights and the liberties of the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized worldwide. This is why the Cuban government embraces foreign aid and global solidarity, because they believe it was time that the values of capitalism and individuality, as enforced by the United States, must be done away with. However, it is through their representation of solidarity with those oppressed countries that reveals the patriarchal undertones of the Hombre Nuevo. René Maderas' poster, as in Vietnam, tenacity, organization, and discipline, and Modesto Brolio's poster, freedom for student political prisoners in Latin America and the Caribbean, both depict the countries in need as women. Representing Vietnam and oppressed countries in Latin America as women suggests that the Hombre Nuevo believes women are marginalized, oppressed, and weak. But the new man, with all of his battlefield courage, possesses the power to liberate women. This raises the question if the new man believes that women can liberate themselves without the man. Lastly, to answer your question, the position of women is due to not just economic issue, but a cultural and religious influence as well. Cuban artists link the guerrillas' courageous efforts toward justice and non-material world to the life of Jesus Christ. For instance, Alfredo Rosgard's poster, Guerrilla Christ, depicts Jesus with a rifle strapped to his back. Additionally, Rosgard's depiction of Christ strays away from the Euro image of Christ that has brown hair, pale skin, and blue eyes. Instead, Rosgard's image of Christ has features similar to the men in Maderas' poster with Castro. Brown eyes, black hair, black facial hair, dark skin complexion, a gun, and forest green shirts. Rosgard's vision of the modern-day Christ as a Cuban guerrilla reveals Cuban guerrillas view themselves as Christ-like. And so, the big brothers, the saviors of the marginalized world, are like the savior of man, and they are both just that, a man.
Dr. Reverend Liam, you make an interesting point. But I'm sure the listeners, as I am myself, are curious about the extent to which religion could have shaped a state so decidedly atheist. I mean, could my assumptions as to the culturally limited influence of religion that religion played in the 1960s and 70s Cuba be that far from correct? I'm wondering if Dr. Caulfield can provide some perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually very interesting. As with all things in relation to this revolution, especially related to the role of and the result for women, it's a fascinating mixture of paradoxes. Because it was an atheist state, officially, and the Catholic Church openly rejected communism, there was definitely a lot of conversation that in fact did not happen. The Catholic Church had taken a decidedly counter-revolutionary position during the early years of the revolution. The Catholic Church had also been strongly associated not only with Spain, but with the urban middle class, while Protestant churches were overwhelmingly associated with the United States. Because of this, formal church membership and attendance sharply declined during this period. Religion, especially Catholicism, became something which was meant to be private. Because of this separation of the church from the state formally, and because of the lack of engagement from the people, the explosion of various movements and shifts in the Catholic Church did not have the same impact in Cuba that they did in other parts of the world. For example, Vatican II, perhaps the greatest turning point in the Church and its practices in recent history, took place in 1962 to 1965. Also during this time period came the emergence of liberation theology among many Latin American churches. Both of these movements in the Church were highly influential in not only shaping religious practice, but also culture for societies in which church had been so intertwined. Cuba shared this colonial past in relation to the Church with much of Latin American countries, but did not share in these new developments in church life in the same way. So Cuba was left carrying the weight of a colonial church and a now anachronistic model of church, but not engaged enough in the movements of the church to share the advancements of the 60s and 70s. Thus, religion, after all, was an integral role in women during and post-revolution. Yet again, as exemplified in the life of the church, we have structural and theological changes happening formally throughout the world, but a deeply seated and fervent patriarchy persisting through the vestiges of religious culture that were left in Cuba. Another example of this would be the mixture of Afro-Cuban religious traditions. In these religions, orishas, which could be paralleled to the Christian conception of saints, were mostly, if not all, male figures. Mark Blanchard, in his piece From Cuba with the Saints, states, "In the construction of the Cuban nation, we need to add that, except for the Virgin of the Cobre in Santiago de Cuba and the Virgin of Regla in Regla, Havana's second harbor, and their Afro-Cuban equivalent, Oshun, the Orisha love of sex, maternity, and marriage, most of the Orishas have been men, suggesting that the task of combining sainthood and nation has been given to the males. Thus, holiness continued to be associated with maleness, unless it were to be in standard female roles and figures, as in the Virgin Mary or an Orisha of sex, maternity, and marriage." Blanchard further discusses how the a-religious nature of the Cuban national project, Castro, Guevara, and other men of the revolution ended up playing the parts of saints or holy men to be aspired to in both Cuba and other places. Looking at these two images of the Virgin Mary and the Orisha, typically associated with women, we see a distinctive form of art, different from the art of the revolution we have been discussing today, but it's also uniquely Cuban. As Carly mentioned, sometimes we learn more from what's not present than what is present. We don't see religious representations of women in any of the posters or propaganda perpetrated by the government. We see very few things, as Liam touched upon, for example, in the image of the gorilla Jesus, which is a distinctly male figure and also distinctly anti-church. We can see in the images of both La Virgen de la Caridad de Cobre and in the image of Ochun limited, elusive forms of both femininity and holiness. So culturally, females were left to reconcile that to be sacred or holy was to be masculine, while there was still strong undercurrents and cultural forces keeping them tied to exclusively domestic life, as seen in this image of propaganda put on by Castro. As Liam described with the image of the gorilla Jesus, while things formally have changed for females in the society with greater opportunities and recognition, there remain few strong social precedents to provide a radical change for women in the undertones and persistent effects of the culture.
Thank you, Dr. Caulfield. I think that your religious perspective helps to illustrate yet another way in which antiquated gender ideals still held cultural currency despite a revolution that appeared to champion women's equality, inclusion, and expanding agency. In fact, you all paint a far more complex and nonlinear understanding of women's empowerment during this period that was affected by economic concerns, veiled institutionalized patriarchy both in the construction of revolutionary ideals as well as general cultural discourse, and a field of power ultimately still run by men reluctant to cede their valorized dominant position. Your points are well grounded and articulated through the poster mediums you analyze. I'm impressed with your abilities to implicate gender and economic shifts within these visual representations. I think you have left our listeners with a lot to digest and work through. I want to extend my deepest gratitude for you all sharing your take on this. Till next time.